Welcome to another episode of Witty CFB. Your host Rob Sheply here, and on today's episode, we are to be discussing Georgia football, in particular, the amount of arrests that they've accumulated over 2024 and 2023, as well as the grand picture, which is the Georgia arrests. To me, what this really symbolizes is the fact that we, the college football at this point, needs a commissioner. I mean, I wouldn't say that the amount of arrests that we've seen is maybe as high as Florida as mid 2000s Florida, but we're getting to that point. I mean, you have to think to yourself, the reason that this is going on is a couple of things. One, there's a issue with the culture and the discipline down there, and quite frankly, the administration and the chancellors and all those guys are, and Kirby Smart in particular, they're not gonna really do anything about it unless they start losing. As long as they keep winning and as long as they're national champions, then nobody really gives a shit what they do. And the reality is, because the NCAA has no legitimate authority anymore, they can't penalize them by putting on probation, or limiting scholarships, or anything like that, like they used to do back in the day. I mean, if you talk 15, 20 years ago, if Georgia had the amount of rest that they did in one season, the NCAA would be all over them saying, "Hey, yo, what are you doing? Get this together. How come this is happening?" Et cetera, et cetera. And this is really just another example of, there being no sort of structure in the NCAA. I mean, if you want to talk, we can have this same discussion talking about NIL, the transfer portal. We can talk about red shirting, and these players getting arrested is indicative of that, because at the end of the day, I'm a firm believer in, college sports is supposed to be obviously it is a platform for these athletes to play football and to entertain and to bring money to the school, and all that's great too. But I think another element of just college sports in general, which I think primarily draws me in, is just the general fact that, at the end of the day, college football and, all collegiate sports, I mean, it's supposed to better the lives of, of young people who, have a gift, who've worked very hard to do that. And, you know, it should be a win-win situation where the school gives them a scholarship, and hopefully you get an education, you use the degree, and you either play in the NFL, or you walk away with your bachelor's degree debt free and make some money and live your life. But really, this another the reason why this is even crazier too is the fact of, I think, for people who maybe don't follow college football as much as you as much as I do, is the fact that, compared to, and generally speaking, these college football players get coddled so freaking much now, especially because they're getting paid now. I mean, granted, I mean, I'm not saying every college football player does this, but majority of them take bullshit classes. You have a GPA of a 2.0, and the hardest class you have is probably classical music, or some BS class like that all you really have to do is show up and you get an A. So I think part of this conversation is about just the overall culture of college football to a degree, because the problem is, if you discipline these kids too much, then you're not gonna get any recruits anymore, because players are gonna say, "Oh, okay, you're are gonna say, oh, you're gonna bust my balls about this. Okay, well, I'm just gonna transfer now." Or, if you decide to say, "Hey, you have to go to class now," then you know they'll just hire a tutor, and more often times than not, they can always just talk to the professor too. But really, what this Georgia situation is indicative of is, we're just getting to a point now where there just needs to be a shift in terms of, how college football is structured, because everything right now seems so fragmented to the point where it's just unsustainable anymore. Now, quite frankly, the NCAA model, I wouldn't necessarily say there was anything bad with it in theory, because obviously, really the model before was the NCAA is kind of just overseeing college athletics in general, and they're, being responsible to making sure that, there's certain guidelines in place, there's a set of rules and regulations and all that stuff. But now it's to the point where, you have the state authorities and the federal authorities, and you have all these lawsuits to the point where the NCAA is essentially, powerless in terms of, doing anything really. And from the NCAA's perspective, obviously they kind of want to string this along as long as they can, because for them, it is a source of revenue for people. It does bring in jobs for these people, but it's to the point now where college football and probably arguably college basketball too are just growing in a capacity where they need to just start governing themselves. And I'm for one. I've said this on the show multiple times. I'm pretty firm in terms of being a kind of a traditional sort of guy where it should be you play for one school, you play for 4 years, and that should be it. And I think it's great that players are starting to get paid now and doing all that too. But you have to draw a line somewhere. Is the reality of it, and it has to start somewhere. And if you ask me in terms of, one of the things that I think would be realistic to do, I think just having some sort of equivalent of a commissioner. I'm not saying it has to be on the level of Roger Goodell, for example, but it could also even just be, an honorary title, for example. It doesn't have to be someone who's necessarily making, big executive decisions. It could just be someone who's just overlooking the sport to make sure that, that programs are, abiding by the set of rules that everybody's agreeing upon. That we're making sure that players are going to class, upholding their GPAs, and most importantly, staying out of trouble and being good, members of society. And you definitely do kind of see this a lot where a lot of these players are privileged to some extent. I mean, a lot of them too have worked their ass off to get there, and we're not taking away from that. But at the same time too, I think a part of just college athletics in general is just it's supposed to be it should be beneficial for everybody, because at the end of the day, what I love to see is kids who get a chance to play college football, be able to talk about these experiences for the rest of their life, and then you translate that into other aspects of your life, whether it's starting a business or having a family or doing any of those things. But it's to the point now where you see these Georgia headlines. Over 8 players have gotten arrested for a multitude of different things. And yes, it's indicative of the culture that Kirby Smart has down at Georgia. But to me, the grand point of this that I think really needs to be driven home is we're getting to a point where a lot of these examples are just showing that there needs to be a significant shift in college football. And if you ask me, one of the fundamental things that has to happen is having some sort of college football commissioner. Now, I sat down and compiled a couple of people who I think would be a phenomenal choice to oversee this, to be the inaugural guy. I mean, I think first off, a guy that I think would be fairly obvious is Oliver Luck. He did some work with the XFL, so he knows what it's like to start up a football league and be in that administrative role and be able to handle the balancing act between looking after the players, looking after the coaches, being able to work with the networks and do all that stuff. And you know, generally speaking, around all circles, he really is that kind of guy that he's well respected. He's a guy that people will rally around and support. So I think he would be a really good example. Sort of another example that I can think of who's currently coaching now would be North Carolina's Mac Brown, I who I admire tremendously. And if you haven't already, I highly recommend checking out Mac Brown's interview with Josh Pate, where he does kind of talk about he talks about the differences that he's seen in college football over the past 30, 40 years. And it's really great to see those insights. And you can just tell as he's talking how passionate, how excited, how enthusiastic he is. And having somebody with that voice and that credibility would really do wonders to college football. And I think he would set just a tremendous example and lead the charge in terms of enacting long-term positive change. That's good for everybody. And then I'd say the most fairly obvious example would be Nick Saban. Now, I would again, I think all three of them are tremendous options, but I think Nick Saban would be the obvious one. I mean, even when he, talked with Congress and he talked with Reese Davis, I mean, one of the most obvious reasons why he didn't want to, why he retired was, yes, he's in his 70s and coaching, coaching the transfer portal, it's pretty much a full time year job. But I think one of the things that I found to be of relevance is the fact that he just said, "Hey, it's essentially just a free for all now," and you know, there's only so much you can do. I mean, between you can talk about the Connor Stallions, the the play calling scandal. You can talk about NIL transfer report. We can talk about all these different things, and I think he would just bring some very fascinating insights in terms of understanding these complex issues that ultimately can be resolved if the right amount of the right people are getting the SEC commissioner, the Big Ten commissioner, all the commissioners together, some of the top coaches, people from, and perhaps even get some feedback from the NCAA. I mean, they're, at the end of the day, they are a resource too. Now, I think a lot of people do crap on the NCAA for a number of reasons, which I think, primarily speaking, are all pretty valid. But at the same time, too, if you do want to have this transition of passing the guard from the NCAA to college football eventually governing themselves, you're going to get to a point where I think the NCAA is going to be an important factor in terms of making sure that transition goes smoothly and making sure that the right guidelines are in place so that as so that all team all college programs are benefiting from this, and most importantly, it assures that the game stays alive for hopefully years to come, because I've been watching college football for going ever since, as long as I can remember. And I hope that when I'm older eventually, that this game is still just excited and passionate about as I hope to be.